Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar session today on ISO 7001, the new version which came out end of last year. I have with me a very, very known speaker today from Australia, who's also a senior auditor with us, Andrew Coyle. Andrew has more than 3 decades of experience with auditing and training for ISMS and various other industry standards. Before we begin the session, I have just a few quick points. The session today will be recorded, so please do not worry if you some moments here or there. The session recording will be shared with you 1 week after the webinar concludes. Whatever questions you have, please keep sending us on chat. Once Andrew finishes his presentation, we will have a question answer round where we will be able to take all your questions. So you can just start sending questions on chat once you have them. We also would be having a live Q&A session, as I just told you. So if there are any industry related questions, if there are any training related questions, please reach out. We'll be happy to help. Andrew, over to you now.
Okay, thank you, Pallavi. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar session on ISO 27001 2022, the new version of the Information Security Standard. Pallavi, next please. So 27001 has changed. Go to slide number 3, please, Pallavi. So information security is a very important standard in the last few years. In Australia, there has been at least 3 significant data breaches in the last 5 or 6 months, which have made the televisions over here in Australia and New Zealand, and it has put a new emphasis on the information security, the ISO 27001 standard. So if we're looking at the screen, which is saying, why do we implement an ISMS? Again, this is really becoming more pertinent as a result of the data breaches, which are becoming more prevalent in society. So from a business point of view, the benefits of having an ISMS are as shown on the screen. It allows you to achieve an organization control over your various security objectives and targets. It allows you to meet any contractual requirements that you may have in place over the security or the sensitivity and the management of sensitive or personal information. It helps to embed a good culture into the organization so that you minimize the risk of any security weaknesses or lapses within the organization taking place. From a technical point of view, again, the ISO 27001 standard does allow the organization to focus on key activities within the business to make sure that you are as secure and as safe as you can be. The ISO 27001 standard, or standards in general, tend to review or revise themselves every 7 or 8 years. This standard should have been reissued in 2020 because the previous version was in 2013. The pandemic put a delay on the publication of the standard, and it was eventually published in October of last year, 2022. When a standard is changed, there isn't a lot of changes that are forced by the standard. When an ISO document is updated, it primarily is the opportunity to update the standard to reflect the changes that have taken place in the environmental or the information security environment. So if you do not already have an ISO registration or a management system in place and you're looking for purchasing ISO 27001 as a guide as to what you need to implement to be able to be compliant to the standard. The standard gives you good practice. It documents good working practice, and that is what we will show over the next few slides, some of the key changes. No standard will tell the organisation how to apply it. It will identify controls, which are the good practices that should be adopted. But each organisation will and can apply these controls in a completely different manner from one another. And the standard accommodates that. It does not know who you are. It does not know what industry sector you're in. It does not know the size of the organisation, the complexity of the organisation. So for that reason, as a document, it has its limitations as to how it can be used as a guide. But it does provide a breakdown on the good practices, the areas of control that should be applied to be able to implement an information security management system. Next slide 4, please. Governance, risk and compliance, GRC, is one of the key elements. And what this screen is trying to show is that the ISO 27001 management system helps with the organization's GRC requirements. From a governance point of view, the first cell, clause 4 of a standard, the context of the organization, that's where the standard is asking you to look at yourself, identify what you do, identify the core activities that you are providing to your clients, looking at your internal controls. So that's the starting point of any ISMS, as it is for GRC. But where 27001 standard then assists in applying a GRC level of control is through the various activities within the document. The information security management system itself is the key overall umbrella of having good governance, risk and compliance. There are various clauses within the standard itself, primarily clause 6, which address the risk element. And there is another clause, which is legal compliance, which addresses the compliance element. So from the diagram on the screen, you can see that 27001, the standard, will assist in providing that framework to support your organization's GRC approach. Along the right-hand side, the 4 boxes on the right make reference to some of the key outputs or outcomes from implementing ISO 27001. There will be a document called Statement of Applicability, an SOA, and that's where you will look at all of the controls that we'll go through in a second, the requirements of the standard and how you can pull them together. The title of ISO 27001 is the requirements. So it is the standard that an organization will be assessed against by LRQA and our competitors, the other certification bodies. There are other elements, documents within the ISO 27000 family. One key one would be 27002, which is a guidance document. But of all the other documents that you may come across under the 27000 family banner, only 27001 is the document which is actually auditable. A certification body can only audit you against 27001. We cannot audit against 27002, 27005, or any of the other documents. They are all guidance documents to help provide clarity and interpretation of the 27001 requirements for differing sectors or industries. Next slide, please, number 4. So, overall, what has changed within the standard? Well, the key changes are the standard has taken the opportunity to simplify. The structure of the ISO 27001 standard is exactly the same as the other management system standards for quality, safety, and environment. And they all have the same core requirements of clauses 4 through 10. So from a 27001 perspective, for the core, for the main clauses at the front, there has been an increased focus on risk treatment. It's a risk-based management system, and the risk management activity is very central in maintaining and implementing your ISO 27001 management system. So it has increased its awareness of risk treatment rather than just identify risks and have a risk register. We want effective treatments and those treatments to be effective in their implementation. If you are familiar with the 2013 version of the standard, the technical part of the standard, the Annex A element of the 2013 standard, identified control headings and control objectives, and then actual control details. So the 2022 version of the standard is simplified by literally removing the control objectives. As there was a level of duplication within the Annex A element of the standard. Then Annex A itself, the sort of technical element, went through a significant simplification. Previously, there were 114 specified controls. Within the 2022 version, that has been reduced down to 93. So that has achieved through consolidation, removing of duplication from some of the controls that appeared in the 2013 version. The opportunity was also taken to streamline the structure of the technical controls down into 4, what they could now call themes, 4 headings with a control set. And we'll talk you through those in a slide or two. So what does it really mean to the changes in those of you who have a management system in place? Well, the core management elements of the standard are all to address the organization, the structure of the organization, being aware of who you are, what interested parties you have, making sure you have effective management, buy-in, leadership controls. These are really fundamentally unchanged from the 2013 version. But the technical level of controls has been the area which has been simplified and updated. As I said in my introduction, when a standard is reissued or revised, it is because industry has moved on in leaps and bounds. The risk from cybersecurity and the need for more robust threat intelligence is now more necessary than it was in 2013, when there was not as much cyber hacking taking place and the use of cloud was not as prevalent as it was now. So the opportunity was taken for the standard to update itself to better reflect the practices which are taking place within industry nowadays. And hopefully, if you do, when we follow through the remainder of the slideshow, and you look at your management system and compare the 2013 version with the 2022 version, in a lot of instances, the changes that would have been introduced or may have been introduced into the 2022 standard may already be in place within your organization. You may already be doing a lot of the new requirements that have been brought into 27001, and that's not unexpected because the standard is now 10 years out of date since it was last published. So as I said a moment ago, it's taken the opportunity to update itself to more better reflect the requirements of various industries in the security posture as of today, 2023, rather than 10 years ago in 2013. Next slide, please. One of the key core elements of this standard is carrying out a robust risk assessment. It's a very clear risk-based standard. So this slide is showing the key steps that fall into the requirements of clause 6, so one of the core clauses. So it asks you to identify potential threats and risks to your organization, carry out an analysis of those activities, determine the necessary treatments that you have to put in place, do a gap analysis. Do we have sufficient controls in place to address the risks that we've identified, or do we need to do more? Basically, are we able to bring the risks and the threats down to an acceptable level for each organization. And each organization's tolerance to risk, to the threats, will differ. So that's why the standard cannot be very specific into how to carry out a risk assessment. It basically just leaves it as a very high level. Please do a review of your risks, identify the treatments that require to be applied, use the Annex A, the ISO 27001 controls as possible mitigations to be able to manage those risks. So that will then allow you to then produce one of the core documents, cell 4 on the screen, which is to create a statement of applicability. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with that document, it is literally what it says as its title. It's a statement of applicability. So for all the controls that we will see are contained within the ISO 27001 standard, not every organization needs to identify every control. And the statement of applicability allows you to then look at those controls. And for your organization, for your operation, you may be able to exclude some of the controls. That is permissible under the standard, as long as you can justify why it is not applicable to yourself. It may be such that one of the old controls was there shall be controls over secure delivery areas. Now, if you're an office-based activity and you're on the 14th floor of a building, an office block, you may not have a delivery area. You may not have that opportunity for large goods to be delivered to a basement, moved up. In which case, if that is the case, then you would have been quite valid to justify that requirement as an exclusion, because it does not apply to yourself. But if you did have a delivery bay, a delivery area, and there were options for access to be given to your floor from, say, a goods elevator, then you could not exclude it because it is applicable. You do have to have a control to make sure that no one can access your workspace from that goods elevator, should that be the case. So your statement of applicability is a way of doing that. And from that statement of applicability in your risk assessment, you would then be able to create your risk treatment plans. So it's a very high-level, brief explanation of where Clause 6 of the standard is looking for you to address risk management. The standards always ask you to set objectives. It's a proactive measure. An organisation who have a 27001 management system, and certainly an organisation who have it certified by a certification body, we expect that you will be setting objectives that will make you improve. The objectives should be under the moniker of SMART: specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timed, rather than aspirational. Our objective is to be the #1 organisation and the most secure organisation in our country. That is a very weak objective to set. You cannot measure yourself against that. It's difficult to determine whether you've actually achieved your objective. So the 27001 standard does require you to set reasonable, proactive, practical, and achievable objectives. And clauses 4, 5, and 9 of the ISO standard all touch on the requirement to have realistic objectives set in place and to be able to monitor your achievement of those objectives. Next slide, please. So with the changes to 27001, your statement of applicability will be impacted. You will have to review your current document and look at the new clauses, the new controls. The organizations that LRQA have audited against this new standard, I can tell you for a fact that some of them try to keep the same statement of applicability document and just cross-refer the old standard clauses to the new clauses. It doesn't work. There is so much of a change, there is so much integration that has taken place. It is not really practical to try and use your existing statement of applicability as a guidepost to the new standard. It is much simpler to just rewrite and redraft your SOA, your statement of applicability, to suit the new requirements. But the document itself, the approach to taking is still unchanged. You would look at the controls that are in place. You would then identify which of these controls do apply to yourself and do not apply. And if they are applicable, you should explain how and where you are managing that control. If the control is not applicable, the statement of applicability should clearly explain why it is not applicable. So this statement of applicability is a key document within an ISO 27001 management system. As an assessing body and as an information security auditor, your statement of applicability is the critical document that we would use when we are doing any audit with yourself, because that document ties your organization's security management system to the standard. It's a guidepost to say we are aware the standard has these requirements, and your statement of applicability is produced to be able to show how you have addressed the applicable controls and what level of control, a procedure or work instruction or a process that you have in place to be able to show that you are implementing and maintaining that control in an effective manner. Next slide, please. So the transition to the new standard from the old standard. So what will this look like? Well, if you already have if the organization already has 27001 2013, then what will happen with the migration is there is a 3-year time frame by which transfer movement from the 2013 standard to the 2022 standard must apply. The standard was issued on October 2022, which means that by October 2025, everyone who has ISO 27001 2013 must have migrated over to the 2022 version. If you do have a 2013 registration and you do not complete the transition before October of 2025, you will effectively lose your ISO registration and you will have to start from the beginning, go through a full stage 1 and the stage 2 to gain registration to the 2022 version. Certification bodies have a framework which is that you can migrate at any time during that 3-year period. So as long as you have a current registration, you can determine whether you are ready for migration over to the new standard in 2023, 2024, or 2025. As long as you migrate and transfer over before the end of October 2025, that will be appropriate. Obviously, the time frame is based on how much of a change is needed from your management system to address the 2022 version of the standard from a 2013 version. But here's a 3-year maximum time frame. If you do not have a 2013 registration and you're embarking ISO 27001 for the first time, then up until the midpoint of that 3-year period, so by April of 2024, up till April 2024, a certification body can still assess against the 2013 version of the standard. So if you felt you needed a registration but were not quite able to go to the 2022 version now, you could request registration to the 2013 version of the standard, but what it would mean is you would have to go through an additional migration over to the 22 version before October of 2025. So it depends on your need. It can be achievable, but once April 2024 deadline kicks in, no one will be able to be assessed against the 2013 version of the standard after April 2024. It would have to be against the 2022 version of the standard. And that break is just to allow organizations who have worked towards getting to the point of being audited against the 2013 standard, like this month or next month or the next 6 months, can still proceed with their registration to the old standard. The new standard will then take place sometime before the October 25 deadline. Most certification bodies work around a core of a 3-year recertification cycle. So even though the registrations and your certificates are valid, or your registration is valid forever, the certificate itself has a 3-year period, and that's where the 3-year deadline comes in. So if you do have a certificate renewal or a recertification audit scheduled between now and October 2025, most certification bodies would recommend try and achieve your registration, the migration over at your recertification. It means we don't have to add any extra time. There should be sufficient time in your renewal visit to accommodate the migration over to 2022 version. But to be able to make that determination, you really need to go back and look at the new controls, look at your statement of applicability, identify any gaps that may have taken place, and have controls and processes in place to address the gaps, the new requirements, which we'll discuss in a moment. So hopefully that clarifies what the transition period is. Just to summarize, deadline of October 2025. Everyone who is presently registered to the 2013 version must be migrated over to the 2022 version before October of 2025. Next slide, please. Literally just spoken over that. So the 3-year period. This one difference on that slide, which I did not mention, is that I said that if anyone does register to the 2013 standard, the deadline for that certificate will be October 2025. So what I mean by that is, if you go through your audit to the 2013 in, say, December of this year, December 2023, normally your certificate would be valid for 3 years. So your recertification would identify itself for December of 2026, 3 years from the date of your initial assessment. But because the deadline for the removal of the 2013 standard is October of 2025, a certificate that would be issued would only be valid until that deadline. So there will not be a full 3-year period for anyone who's been registered to the old standard this year. It will limit yourself to the October 2025 deadline. When we do the transition, because, as we'll see in a few slides from now, there are additional controls that have been added, but in the main, the existing controls that are in the 2013 version of the standard are remained and contained within the 2022 version of the standard. So when we're doing a migration audit against an organization who already have the 27001 registration, we would be focusing in on the new requirements. We need to be able to see evidence provided by yourselves that the new controls that have been implemented, that have been introduced to standard, have been addressed. The other controls, which already are part of your information security management system, we know they're in place. Your registration tells us that these controls are in place. So we do not have to spend a lot of time looking at those existing controls. We will do a sampling approach. But the approach for the migration will be, if you have a registration, we will concentrate on the new clauses, making sure those are effective and implemented. And we will work on a sample of the remaining clauses, as we'll show in 1 or 2 slides coming up. A lot of the controls have been consolidated. So where there were 3 controls looking at awareness, making people aware of security issues, these will all have been simplified into a single control. So that's where the reduction from 114 to 93 has came. We will be able to reduce 3 requirements which are very similar into a single requirement. And from that, by that approach being taken, we will not have to look at each individual control from scratch. Only if you're going through the assessment for the first time against 2022 would we need to look at every control and make sure they're all implemented. For an existing client, we would take an approach of looking at the new controls and then just sampling some of the others to make sure they are maintained and implemented. And again, just reiterate the duplicate of what I said in the last slide. We can do the migration audit at any time. Those of you who are registered to 2013, there will typically be one additional day required to do the migration, and that's a requirement from the assessment body. So the country organisation for Australia's JASANs, they require additional time to be able to do the migration. So a rule of thumb would be for an existing client, we would probably add 1 day extra onto your next visit so that we can specifically look at the new requirements. And the accreditation body's rationale behind that is you have a contract with your certification body for the number of days against 2013. To be able to migrate over to 2022, we need to do an additional review so that if you did fail and did not meet the criteria for the 2022 standard, you wouldn't lose your 2013 registration at that time. So contractual requirement at the moment is sort of 2013 standard, and we would need to do an extra, typically 1 day is the LRQA approach to address the migration so that we can produce a second report. Basically, we produce a report that says we're comfortable that you're still meeting the 2013 standard, so that can be retained. And then we do a separate report which is saying we're now happy that your 2013 standard has been updated to reflect the 2022 version. So that is the practical way by which the migration audit will take place. So themes and attributes. I spoke about that at the beginning. The standard has revised itself into 4 themes. And if we look at those, the 4 themes are shown on the next slide. So the reorganization of the controls. So they've moved it into 4 themes, which are the categories. And then they have replaced, these 4 themes replaced the 14 controls that were in the old 2013 version. So A5, organizational policies, A6, A7, A8. Those Annex A controls, A5 through A18, have now all been consolidated into these 4. There are 11 new controls which have been added, and these will have to be addressed to be able to have a successful migration. So you can see from the bottom slide, the 4 themes that have been pulled together is organizational controls. Second one, people controls. The third one is physical controls. And the final one is technological controls. So these are the 4 headings where each of the individual Annex A controls will now sit. So you can see, hopefully, by reducing the previous A5, A6, A7, they've consolidated a lot of the content into one of these 4 control themes to make it a lot easier and a lot simpler. Next one, please. So for the themes, again, as you can see, the 4 themes then have related controls. So for the organizational control, there are 37 specified controls in that theme. For the people controls, there are 8 specified. Physical controls have 14, and the technological controls have 34. So hopefully that gives a good indication as where the focus of certainly the standard has moved on. So the 2 larger themes with the majority of the controls are the controls under the organization's management and the technological controls. The physical security controls has added a few from earlier other controls, and the people controls effectively are unchanged. So when we look at each of those themes, if you look at the people controls, they are exactly the same as they are under the 2013 version of the standard. They're all the human resource requirements for onboarding process, offboarding process, disciplinary process, having a screening control. So there's minimal changes to the people, but the bulk of the changes are going to fall into the organizational and the technological controls. Then once we have the themes, and once you've looked at the individual controls, that will then allow you to determine the various attributes. The standard has introduced that term, which falls into one of those 5 areas. Initially, those attributes will not have a big impact on your migration. Where I have found them beneficial is when I'm doing a review, if I was looking at a client and I'm looking at trying to determine how effective their management system is, I find it useful if the statement of applicability makes reference to which attribute applies, so that I can do a filter. It allows myself and yourself as the client, the organization, to look at your controls and determine which controls do we have in place which will address each of those attributes. How many controls are in relation to cybersecurity? How many controls do we have in relation to the security requirements? So the attributes allow you to look at your Annex A controls and determine whether it is there to protect, whether it is there to maintain the integrity of the information, whether it's there to provide compliance to legislation. So the attributes are fairly new to this standard, but in the early days, they won't by themselves have a huge impact on how you change or update your ISOS documentation to reflect the 27001-2022 standard. So the groupings will help going forward. Next one, please. So a lot of the controls have been reorganized. So asset management, as you can see on the screen, they now have 10 controls. Oh, sorry, there was 10 controls. They have now been reduced to 6. Policies, there has been an increase in some of the policies that have been required. There are 7 additional policies that have been stipulated in the new standard, and those are documents that will need to be implemented to achieve a successful migration. Although when you read the standard, it now states more times there shall be a policy on this. It doesn't mean that you will need to produce existing or new policies. You may find that your current policy under 2013 would actually satisfy 2 of the policies that are stipulated in the standard. Experience tells me that writing policies around your processes and your organization structure, you will find that one document, one policy that you have produced will satisfy a requirement of a standard. A common one would be, say, you have an acceptable use policy. So you may have within the acceptable use policy coverage over teleworking or home working. So that one document that you have produced, your acceptable use policy, would, in that scenario, satisfy 2 requirements of a standard. The standard will say you will have an acceptable use policy, and you will also have a teleworking home working policy. So they can be combined. So again, part of the migration and the review that you would do is looking at all of the policies that are now stipulated by the standard, and then making sure that you have them in place. If you do not have it in place, then you may have to produce a new policy. But in the 2 organizations that I have migrated so far this year, they have had all of the new requirements already embedded into their current documentation. So they have not had to produce any new policy documents for the first time. There are a lot of overlaps with the old standard, and again, this 2022 version has then taken it into consideration, and they have produced shared responsibilities over the implementation of the system. Next one, please. So it's just a summary of the 11 new controls. So you can see that 3 have been added into the organizational theme. 1 has been added into the physical control, which is the security monitoring. 2013 did have no requirement to actually monitor security. It only took it to the point of you shall have physical security controls, but it did not require any monitoring. This has now been added to the 2022 version, but that's the only change to the physical controls, and the bulk of the controls are under the technical controls. So you can see that there's nothing there for the people control, and as I said, there has been nothing added to the people controls. So what was previously under Annex 7 Human Resources remains as it is. It still fits into the new theme of people, but there is a lot of clarity and simplification taking place. So these are the controls, as I said, when we're doing a migration. These 11 controls are the ones which will be the focus. We will need to see evidence that you have these embedded into your management system. And as long as you can show that those 11 controls have been added and are effective, then the remaining controls are already in your system. So we should not have to look at them from zero. Next slide, please. So just an example. So one of the new controls was cloud services. Again, as I said at the beginning of the webinar, cloud was not really a high emphasis during the early days of 2013, 2014, when the previous version of the standard was produced. But in the last 5, 6, 7 years, yeah, there's been a huge movement onto cloud services. So the way the standard has broken down is as summarized on that screen. So it identifies the controls and the purpose. So when we are assessing you against these new controls, this is what we will be looking for you to provide evidence that you have sufficient control over this requirement for your organization, that you do have relevant processes, you've identified the risks of cloud services into your system, and we will then discuss the introduction of this with you at the migration audit. Similar approach for the next one, next slide, which was threat intelligence. Again, this is a new control which is not currently embedded into the 2013 standard. So by using the content of the control and working through your risk process, you will be able to identify the level of improvement that you may need to make to your management system to be able to address the new control that's been introduced. There is a supporting document, ISO 27002, which is a guidance document. And the content of this slide and the previous slide are primarily coming from that guidance document. The requirement of a standard is very simple. You shall maintain the top level. The guidance document 27002 provides a lot more guidance, a lot more understanding of what could be applied. And that's where these slides are coming from. These are extracts from the guidance document as to how and when you may wish to consider applying to address this requirement. But this is all part of the gap analysis that we would ask you to do. We'll talk about in a moment. Next slide, please. Again, data leakage, similar. These are 3 of the 11 new requirements. But working between the standard and your own organizational needs, you can determine whether data leakage or any other new requirement is applicable. Next slide, please. So in the real world of you, the clients, how would you go about it? So up to this point, I've talked theoretically about what the standard's looking for, how we as an organization would be approaching the migration. For yourselves as an organization to approach it, I've mentioned a couple of times that we have went through 2 migration audits so far with clients in Australia. And what I have produced in the next 3 or 4 slides is really just feedback from the clients. I asked the clients how did they approach the migration. The certification body will put out guidance as to what we feel you should do. And as a summary, we expect you to do a gap analysis, look at the new standard, look at the old standard, see where you already have measures in place to satisfy the new controls. And if there is nothing missing, then you may need to add new policies, new procedures, new functions. So I went out to my clients and asked them for feedback as to how they actually addressed the migration. And what they then said, the model they approached was, to look at their own organizational context, look at what they do, look at the requirements of a new standard, and then see whether they already have these contexts in place. There may be new additional interested parties which now come into scope of the audit. You may have new suppliers, new vendors who you are using to be able to address the threat intelligence or the cloud elements, the cybersecurity elements. So because these new requirements have been added, the new controls have been added, we would expect you to look at your interested parties, your risk assessments, and your statement of applicability and see where those 3 elements require to be updated. So by looking at your risk register, you can see whether your new threats have now been introduced because of the new requirements. You can look at your existing measures and controls, and again, see if there's any variation. And we would suggest they came from your original risk review, your risk register. Once you have those in place, then you look at the current controls and then see if there's any modification, any changes that are required. Any other documents that may be necessary. And then eventually you will then be able to look at your management system. So look at your risk register. Do we need to identify new threats or new risks as a result of the additional controls that have been put in place? Conversely, do these additional controls that we're now going to introduce into our management system actually help us to mitigate or manage our risks that we have in our risk register? So by focusing in on your risk register, doing a gap analysis of the new requirements and the existing controls, identifying the variations, and you may find that the new controls will help you to mitigate some of the risks that you have in your current risk management system. But conversely, there may be additional risks that you may now have to bring into your risk management system that perhaps you didn't consider in earlier days, typically around threat intelligence and cybersecurity measures. So that's the gap analysis I spoke about a couple of times. That's where that would come in. So how would we do that? Well, as you can see, you look at your system and your current system and new requirements of a standard. If, as I said earlier, you already have been proactive in implementing your system and the additional requirements of the standard have already been applied by yourself, then really there should be no significant changes required. At the top level, you would possibly potentially have full implementation of the ISO 27001:2022 requirements. Mostly unlikely. The new requirements are being added because they have not been included in 27001 previously. So more than likely, when you look at those 11 new controls, there will be changes, there will be additions that you have to do. So that may show that you are partially compliant. So there may be minor differences, slight modifications that we need to make to our documentation, our system, to be full compliant. Then there could be the third option, the bottom line. Certainly if you're working towards achieving a management system from the beginning, then you may not have controls over all of those Annex A requirements. So you may have significant changes that you may have to make to your management system. But one of those 3 routes would be typically how the migration audit and how you would plan. We're expecting that 80%, if not more, of our existing clients would fall into the middle category. Unlikely they will be fully compliant. There may be one or two clients I can think of who already have measures in place to satisfy the additional controls that have been added, but they are in the main minority. The bulk will be
Hi,
in the middle.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. Just a quick one. I just wanted to, yeah. Just wanted to make you aware that we just have 10 minutes, and there are amazing number of questions coming in. So yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, I can, since the slide is going to be presented to everyone, I'll just skim through a couple of key ones, and then we'll give ourselves more time for the Q&A at the end. Thank you. So yeah, just to summarize, we would expect most of existing 27001 registered organizations will fall into the middle category. There will be minor changes that you'll have to make to be able to fully compliant to your new 2022 version of the standard. So first and foremost, the changes from the feedback we've got from our clients that have migrated, they agree that the changes make sense. They have simplified a lot of the controls. They have identified the duplications that existed in the 2013 standard, and the way that they have been put into one of the 4 themes does make it a lot easier for an organization to then have visibility over the requirement. The use of the 4 themes, again, feedback is that makes sense. Having it under physical, people, technology, and the organizational controls, again, makes it a lot simpler to focus in where your management system can apply. The combination of requirements, again, just to simplify, so we don't have to think, am I addressing this requirement of this clause A16, or am I addressing a requirement of clause A15? Where the previous clauses overlapped, then we do have simplification, and the combination of these controls certainly helps. The other feedback we've received is that they do feel that the 27002 standard does bring benefits. It does provide a lot of clarity and guidance. It is a beast of a document. It's probably 4 times the number of pages than the standard itself, 27001. But the feedback that we've been given is that there is a lot of good guidance as to how we as an organisation can apply the 27002 guidance to help us to produce our new updated standard. So it is there, it is available. I will just reiterate what I mentioned earlier is 27002 is a guidance document. You cannot and will not be assessed for compliance against 27002. The only document that you will be able to be registered against is 27001, the requirements. But the guidance document 27002 is a very useful reference document. Okay, that's the main overview of the standard. So on the face of it, it does look as if it's completely different, but when you actually look at the content of the controls in the way they have been split into the 4 themes, it does make life a lot easier. There is no duplication. There is a lot more simplification. The additional controls that have been added are only because industry and practice requires that just now. We need to have good threat intelligence. We need to be aware of cybersecurity. The confidentiality, integrity, and availability, the 3 cornerstones of information security remain, but it also now brings in a lot of the privacy, protection of private information, all of the other legislative requirements that have come into being in most other countries over the last 5 or 6 years. The standard has just updated itself to be able to reflect the needs and expectations from an information security governance point of view. So hopefully that has given a nice overview of the changes and what would be required for those of you who are already registered to 27001, what the migration approach will be. for those of you who have not been registered but are heading down that route, it will be a lot simpler because there's less controls and more structure between the controls. So to implement a management system against the new standard, we would find it a lot easier than it would have been against the 114 controls against the 2013 version. So at that point, I will stop my talking, and I'm more than happy to take the remaining time for any questions that may have arisen through my presentation.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you so much. That was a great presentation. Thanks a lot. I learned a lot about the standard, and I'm sure all our participants did. We do have, as I said, some amazing questions, and they're actually just 4 minutes, but let's take 10 minutes to quickly try to answer them.
Okay.
So the first question is, if we choose to migrate to the new 2022 version this year, will a new certificate be issued?
Yes, good question. Yes, a new certificate will be issued. Certification bodies have to be accredited. So we have to go through an accreditation review to be able to provide an accredited certificate. We have a 12-month maximum time frame. So October 25, the standard was published. So every certification body globally will have until October 23 to gain accreditation. But in general, if you were to be assessed by, say, LRQA, we have not completed our accreditation audit yet with JASANS, but we can do an audit against the 2022 standard now. We would be able to issue a ISO 27001 2022 certificate, but it would not carry the accreditation mark. So in the UK and Australia, that's the JASANS logo. What would then happen is we would issue an unaccredited certificate against 2022 standard. Then once we gain the accreditation, once the accreditation body has audited ourselves and they have satisfied themselves that we can do the audit, we would then transfer your unaccredited certificate over to an accredited certificate. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, yes. Thank you so much. So the next is, can ISO 27001 certification be achieved by small and medium-sized organizations, or is it more suitable for larger enterprises?
Nope, the standard can apply to any size of organization. I have literally carried out an audit 2 weeks ago where the client had 6 people in their organization. A lot of the technical controls were actually managed by a third-party provider. So yeah, 27001 could be applied by anyone from half a dozen employees up to 15,000. The requirements apply, and the beauty of your statement of applicability is by doing that review of the controls against your organization, your size, and your complexity, you can have a very simple 27001 management system because you do not need to overcomplicate. The standard takes that into consideration, and your certification body can also take that into account when we are doing our review of documents. So short answer is yes, it can apply to small, medium, and extremely large organizations.
Thanks, Andrew. So next is, how can ISO 27001 be adapted or extended to address emerging challenges such as cyber warfare or AI in cyber attacks?
Well, yeah, the approach I would consider is the best way to deal with that emerging threats or emerging risks is through your risk register. You identify any changes to the organization. So the changes can be internal changes or external changes. If you now feel that you've been small enough that you have been under the radar of hackers, that they don't know who you are, so therefore you're low risk. If that suddenly becomes if you now have a more visible presence, either through social media, publicity, marketing, and potentially you're now on the horizon of a hacker, then you could and should bring that into the scope of your risk register, identify it as an emerging threat, and then mitigate controls to reduce that threat to as low as possible. Is that an acceptable answer? Does it clarify the question?
Thank you, Andrew.
Right.
Thanks, Andrew. So last two questions. The first one is, if I do not migrate my organization to the new standard, does my existing certificate expire?
Sorry, what was the first part of this question? If I do not migrate?
So what would happen if I do not migrate my organization to the new standard? Does my current certificate expire?
Yes, the answer is yes. If you have not migrated by October 2025, then your current ISO 27001 2013 certificate will become superseded. At this moment, for the 3-year period, the 2013 standard and the 2022 standard run in parallel. But if you haven't migrated by October 2025, then your registration will lapse and you will no longer be an ISO 27001 registered organization.
Thank you, Andrew. So last question there. It says, if I want to migrate from the 2013 version to the 2022 version, is a gap analysis sufficient to tell me what extra I need to do?
Doing a gap analysis should be more than sufficient to identify the gaps and then focus your attention on what you need to implement to be able to address those gaps. LRQA produce a very simple sort of comparison on our website. It shows the 2013 requirements, the 2022 requirements, and just provides a gap to then say this requirement of 2022 does not appear in 2013, and those are the 11 new clauses. All of the other requirements from the 2013 standard are covered in the 2022. So as I said during the presentation, the initial focus for ourselves would be on the 11 new requirements, which are not part of the 2013 standard. We have to make sure that you have addressed those and you have controls in place to manage those additional controls. The remaining controls, the other 94 minus 11, 83 controls that would be in part of the 2022 standard are already contained within the 2013 standard. So we shouldn't have to spend a lot of time looking at a control that we know is already there. And that's where the gap would show, where your existing control is mapped into the new 2022 control. That activity, by doing that review, you'd be able to identify whether there's any weaknesses from your existing control to be able to satisfy the new control. But in the main, the weaknesses or the gaps are minimal. The significant gaps are the 11 new controls that you do have to address. Okay.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you so much. Thanks for the answers and thanks for the wonderful presentation. Thank you to everybody who joined our webinar today. Again, recording of the webinar will be shared on the email ID you registered for the webinar with. So please keep on the lookout. It should be there in your inbox within a week. Thanks again. Have a great day, great evening, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Safe journeys.